As an officer, you come home after your second or third shift in a row. You are so happy to be able to walk in that door and see your family, but you realize that you're a little on edge or a little flat. You want to connect with them, but you kind of feel like you're half there. As a spouse, you know that your officer needs time to compress, but geez, you haven't seen them in 3 days and you have some things to talk about. These kids are driving you bananas. When do you allow for decompression and when is enough enough? You should get to decompress too. Hypervigilance is a survival mechanism that keeps officers safe on the job, but it doesn't turn off when they come home. When officers and families don't understand this biological process, it can lead to disconnection and tension in relationships. This week, we're going to talk about hypervigilance at home and how to accommodate it and how not to enable it. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Code for Couples podcast.
Welcome to the Code for Couples podcast, focusing on topics for law enforcement officers and couples to keep you and your relationship connected, resilient, and Code 4. Now, your host, law enforcement expert Cindy Doyle, author of Hold the Line and My Wife.
Welcome back to the Code for Couples podcast. I am your host, Cindy Doyle. I started this podcast back in 2017 because I and my husband were clueless about how training and the career of law enforcement was impacting him and our relationship. It was 15 years into our relationship, and I had no clue about the emotional survival for law enforcement by Dr. Kevin Gilmartin or how hypervigilance related to my husband. I knew it to be related to trauma because of my counseling background, but not a physical state my husband would be in for 12 hours a day when he was on shift or how it would be triggered off the job. I was just so clueless on any of how this worked. And so it's really part of the reason why it was like one of my first aha moments in addition to the OODA loop. So what we realized is that it was the cause of some of our struggles to connect. So today what I want to do is I want to make sure that you understand the biological process of hypervigilance, but also that what you need to do as an officer in a couple to counter the impact to keep your relationship connected. So first, let me briefly explain hypervigilance. Hypervigilance is a constant state of being at high alert. It's scanning for threats and preparing for action. And on the job for an officer, it's essential because officers face potential danger every day, right? Even doing routine tasks like traffic stops, anything is a potential threat to an officer. And so they are constantly scanning hands, faces, looking out for potential threats. And the brain in the hypervigilant state helps them to be able to do that better. It's like better, faster, stronger. But it's a biological process that harnesses the amygdala, which is responsible for the fight or flight in the brain, and the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for critical decision making. So cortisol is dumped into the system to allow the officer to be in this hypervigilant state, allowing them to process and recall information quicker, physically respond quicker, and operate at this heightened state of arousal. And we like hypervigilance because hypervigilance keeps an officer safe. So nothing bad about hypervigilance as far as that goes. We want them to have it because we want them to come home. And there's a whole lot more that I could talk about hypervigilance. And if you're more interested in it, you can look into my book, or I have a whole other podcast on it, I think, that will link if that's there. But yeah, so we like hypervigilance. But what goes up must come down because it's a hypervigilant state. I used to be able to see this come on in my husband as he started to get dressed, like probably, 30 minutes before he started to go get dressed, take a shower, things like that. Something would shift in his face. He wouldn't be as clued into me, and he's already thinking about work. And so putting on the uniform, putting on the armor, a lot of times that preparation also goes to this mental state preparation, which is a part of hypervigilance. Back to the what goes up must come down. It's this biological roller coaster. Everything, this heightened state, the brain is a muscle. And so it's being worked out into this hypervigilant state. And when an officer comes off shift, the brain is tired. So the brain is working together, working, being really focused, making sure they stay safe. And when they hit the door in their home, that brain then goes, "Oh, this is nice. I'm at home now." Their brain starts to go down, not their brain, but the cycle goes down, and it leads to this crash that happens that looks like, exhaustion. It's emotionally, physically, and mental exhaustion is what it is. So when they hit the door, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, the intro, an officer might be tired, but most of the time they're happy to come home and see their family and to see you. They want to be with their family. My husband has a saying that unfortunately, family doesn't get the best of you. The best of us many times is at the job and not at home because of this downside of hypervigilance. As much as officers want to be there for their family, many times they're just physically not able because of this hypervigilance roller coaster. So instead, what we see as a family is we start seeing the grumpapuss or flat or reacting in ways that you're like, really? That's a big reaction. And you might have experienced that either because you're doing it as an officer, or maybe your family or your spouse, and you've seen it before. And remember, their brain is tired, right? It's a muscle, it's tired. And so that critical thinking part is exhausted, but that fight or flight response is still available, unfortunately. So many times you can have a larger reaction than you need to, or a more emotional reaction, and maybe even just the exact opposite, where they're not reacting at all. And Gil Martin calls something called the magic chair, where they just sink into the chair and it's like not there at all. It might be scrolling the phone or gaming, disengaged, but for the most part, that's the downside of hypervigilance, and that's giving in to hypervigilance. So, it's like an officer comes home from a shift, and they sit on the couch and they just start clicking, but they're not really watching TV. Maybe you, as the spouse, wants to sit and talk about your day because you haven't been able to talk to them, or just, trying to engage with each other. But because the officer is not engaging and you kind of get these like, responses, the spouse winds up feeling ignored. And then that tension builds. And then we kind of start the cycle. So that's a big part of the cycle. And I realize this is different for everybody. This is just a potential downside of hypervigilance. Some of you are like, I don't have that option. I just got to jump in. But maybe you're not able to engage with your family like you want to. Maybe you have, I always love the younger kids that want to tell you a big old story about something that happened. And you're like, oh my gosh, please stop. Maybe you don't sit in the magic chair, but you realize that you're a little foggy brained. And so once again, this is that downside of hypervigilance. So part of where the conflict starts to occur here is that we all make up stories. Our brain is wired for story. You've probably heard me say that before. And so what we start to do is make up stories about what's happening. This isn't about not caring, right? It's a conditioned neurophysiological response. The officer's brain is still in recovery mode, and their prefrontal cortex is essentially offline. And so these stories we make up is that the officer's not interested, or my spouse, who is not an officer, is demanding, or God, they talk a lot. And so we wind up having not very good conversations. And so part of making up that story is that sometimes they're not interested in a discussion, they're not involved in decision making, or then we start to take it personally that they're not interested in us, or there's something wrong with me, or I'm not sexy enough, right? So we start reacting to the story, and then the officer is reacting to us. And so because we were reacting to them, it's just a vicious cycle. It's this misinterpretation or bad behavior, and the cycle just keeps going. So don't do what I did. I went all the directions with this. The first thing I did was I accommodated and enabled the behavior. I made all the excuses in the world that he was tired, he had a hard job. I told him he didn't need to engage. Don't worry, I'll take that off your plate. I'll make that decision. And don't get me wrong, he loves to cook. That's part of the reason why, part of the way he relaxes. And yeah, when he was off on a weekend, he would help me clean. He did some of the magic chair stuff and like clicking on the TV and not really watching. But I would basically let him off the hook. There were times where he had time to go run an errand if he wanted to, or to go pick up groceries. But sometimes I'd be like, no, 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 you're tired. Other times he'd be like, I got to go to work in 4 hours. And I'd be like, yeah, you got 4 hours. Go do something. But a lot of times I'll let him off the hook. And then I started to get resentful. And then I stopped talking to him as much because my story was that he really wasn't interested in what I was saying. So I did all the wrong things. The other thing I realized that I did was I would think, okay, well, you went to sleep. And so I don't understand why you're still acting like this, because you went to bed and you got up. And what I didn't know is that it takes 18 to 24 hours to recover from this. Most of the time, my husband didn't have 18 to 24 hours between shift. And I'm sure you or your spouses do not either. So what would happen is it kind of compounds. And so if he had 2 days off, because he had that like work 2, off 3, work 3, off 2 kind of a thing. And so when he'd have 2 days off, he would still be foggy because it compounds. But when he had 3 days off, it would be like day 3. I'd be like, holy crap, there you are. And it would be like the guy I married telling me stupid jokes that he does. And like, he's just a funny guy most of the time. And I was just like, where did that go? And then all of a sudden he would reappear. But then it's like, oh crap, I got to go to work again. Right. So it's this ongoing process over and over again, this cycle that just gets in the way. But we didn't know about this until way later into the career, which is why I'm so passionate about talking about this one topic over and over again. Okay, now you know all the bad things I did, and you know that it's a biological process. Let's talk about some ways for correcting this in your relationship. First, if you did not listen to the first episode this year about relationship resolutions, do that, because I included some rituals that you probably want to incorporate that would help your hypervigilant state. So one of that is the coming home ritual. I think there's also in there taking 20 minutes once a week to connect and make sure of decision making of those kinds of things. But not everybody gets 20 minutes to decompress. And so as a couple, you need to talk about what decompression looks like and whether that's going to be activities, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But I really recommend, if you have not listened to that podcast, to either jump in on the blog and read it quickly or go back and listen to that. Okay, number 2, second, officers, here's what you need to engage with the world around you after a shift. Unless you're going straight to bed, then you have a pass. But if you're up at all, what I need you to remember is that the brain is a muscle, right? And so if you stretch it in one direction, you have to stretch it in an opposite direction. Otherwise, it like if you just worked out your right arm, you get a big muscle on your right arm and your left arm looks puny, right? So you got to stretch it in both directions. You see a lot of negative stuff. You experience a lot of negativity. You experience just, bleh, right? So one of the things that I'm going to suggest is that as a couple, start engaging with humor, because that's like the opposite direction of you being able to do something. I know it's easy to start complaining about our day or our week, and there's a place for that. Don't get me wrong. But don't forget to find funny things, people or situations that made you laugh, dad jokes, whatever you can. I still remember a story that my husband came home and told me about. This guy's name was Boutramé, and they kept saying over the radio that it was Butt Rammer, but his name, and the guy was like, "It's Boucherme." But it was stuff like that that he would try to come home and share some things, and I would try to come home and share some things about just humor within our day because you've stretched it in the negative direction all day long. Let's try to find some humor in that. My next suggestion is to try to engage in activities that don't involve much brain power on that downside of hypervigilance. So this can mean a couple things. It can mean like household chores. It could mean bathing your kids or cooking, something that is already, you don't want to be like, well, what do you want to cook? I don't know. What do you want to cook? You already have to have meal prep done. So somebody can just step in and start cooking. That would be something they could do. But it can also be snuggling on the couch or snuggling with your kids. Something already prepared or scheduled is ideal here. So you wanna like, say you wanna watch a show, but already have a plan on what that show might be and take the decision process out of it. Next, my next suggestion is to do a quick download from the day, but stay away from big decisions if possible. So spouses, if there are decisions that you need to make or they need to be done, right? You may want to say something like, here's what I'm thinking. Do you see any holes in my logic? Or do you see any reason why that won't work? Life just happens. And sometimes we can't just be put on hold for decisions. Sometimes decisions have to be made. And so you have to take the lead of that, but you want the buy in of your office or spouse as well. So, have a suggestion for a decision, but maybe you want to write it down as a couple. Y'all might decide you want to have like a log of like, hey, just a reminder, here's what we talked about. Not because you want to go back and gaslight each other with it, but just so like sometimes I'm like, I don't remember talking about that. And he'll have to say, yeah, don't you remember we were watching this, we were doing this? And I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I can remember that. So sometimes depending upon how your relationship is, if you wanna keep like a, "Hey, we decided this," that's fine, do that. But, doing a quick download of your day, like what was the down and dirty of it, and, just touching base as best as you can because you wanna stay connected, but going deep this might not be the great time to do it. Finally, one of the other suggestions I have is make sure that you're giving each other the benefit of the doubt during that downside. So that benefit of the doubt is like, I know this is probably how they meant to say it, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt without that little tone. But it's also not permission to be nasty. Okay. So, officers, you're responsible for your behavior, even though you may have a valid reason of being on that downside of hypervigilance. Let your spouse and family have influence. If they tell you, hey, hmm, getting nasty, and you need to take a 5-minute timeout, and so take the time out and re-engage. Or if you're like me, my husband, I have an eyebrow thing. I raise my left eyebrow really high, and he's like, "Let me try that again." I just have him trained at this point. And so that's our little sign and symbol of like, "I don't think you meant to say it that way." So take influence from them. Spouses, you don't want to criticize, but you also, it's not okay to just let the downside of hypervigilance excuse bad behavior. I hope that makes sense. There's all different kinds of ways to make sure hypervigilance doesn't impact your relationship. We could get into different communication process. We also have to keep in mind that, hey, if there's an event that you're going to, hypervigilance could pop up. There's all different ways for you to kind of think about hypervigilance has this influence in your life, your family life in particular. And as an officer, it can kind of hijack you. So just a couple other notes that I had here. It's totally fine to veg out in front of the TV or go game for a specific period of time. So just like anything, moderation is important. And as long as it's good with your spouse or your family, or, maybe you're there alone, do what you want to do, but don't get caught in it for 6 hours because that's not stretching it in the opposite direction. Remember, when you choose not to stretch your brain in the opposite direction, you're going to have less resilience. And so that's something to think about. When you stretch it, you create more resilience for yourself, which is going to make you a healthier person in the long run. Another thought, I have had officers tell me that they lack motivation. to do things that they want to get done. And when we talk about it, what we realize is that it could be due to that downside of hypervigilance. So I've actually helped officers harness the cycle, allowing for periods of rest and recovery, maybe even doing some things that are routine, but then other periods of time that require creativity or marketing or more drive. You harness the time after the recovery. So you're like, this is a good time to take action. This is my recovery. This is what I can do during my recovery, and kind of harness that cycle. Basically, what you're learning to do is you're understanding how to work with it, but not drive you. It's important for y'all as a couple to understand that this is a recovery process. Make sure you avoid negative interpretation, be aware of reacting or lack of reaction, find ways to engage afterwards and be aware of what's needed, but not accommodate. Acknowledging that need for mental rest can reduce frustration on both of your sides and for the family in general. When hypervigilance is unmanaged, it doesn't just affect the officer, it impacts the entire family dynamic. But with some small intentional changes, law enforcement couples can create a healthier home environment. Hopefully, this down and dirty primer helped you learn something about the process of hypervigilance, or how to recover from the process, or how not to let hypervigilance get in the way of your relationship. Remember, it's there. You've got to remember that it's going to be there, but don't let it be unmanaged. Learn to manage it and how to get back to your family and make your family environment safe. If you're ready for more tools, go check out my book, which you can grab through the link in the show notes as well, or it's available at any online retailer. It is called Hold the Line, The Essential Guide to Protecting Your Law Enforcement Relationship. Just remember, small changes can lead to big connections. Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure to share it with somebody in your department or another spouse. I would really appreciate it. I want to continue to impact law enforcement relationships and keep them Code 4. Until next time, y'all, you keep it Code 4. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about the podcast or Cindy, check out code4couples.com. All intellectual property rights owned by CRLD2 Ventures, LLC, are protected by the firm of 9mm, 45 ACP, 5.56mm, and 12 gauge.